Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today I'm speaking with author and consultant Ben Lyttleton. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
Really honoured to have you as a guest. We've been trying to do this for some time. I was desperate to get you on. We've known each other for a few years because I think we had spoken about some stuff to do with penalty taking with one of your previous books. But today I'm really keen to talk about your book, Leadership Secrets from Football's Top Thinkers. But before we endeavour to go through that book, why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Okay, thanks for that. So my background is as a writer. As you mentioned, I'm an author of football books. I've always been interested in the psychology of performance, and that started with my first book, which was called 12 Yards, The Art and Psychology of the Perfect Penalty. And it was really a forensic look at the strategy around penalty taking. I spent 2 years writing it and realised that actually it was all about psychology and not about technique. And after publishing that, I started working with clubs in that area to help improve their penalty taking strategies and record. So my next book was really a follow-up, an extension of 12 Yards, and it was called Edge, Leadership Secrets from Football's Top Thinkers. And in that, I spoke to some of football's top coaches to understand how they improve talent, specifically in the skill sets that we can't see, psychology and anything above the shoulder. So attributes like resilience, creativity, cohesion, decision-making, adaptability, all these things that I think really can define great players, but the things that we need in all our lives as well. So what I was trying to do with Edge was provide some lessons for all of us in our professional and personal lives, but use football as the lens through which we could learn them. I really believe in the power of football as a force for good in the world. So I write a series of books for kids about football called Football School, which encourage literacy, to open up the curriculum in an exciting way to encourage them to learn and read. And I think 12 Yards and Edge do something quite similar, but in a different way. They use football to make us think about our own talent, our own performance, and how we can improve ourselves and the people around us.
Well, I completely agree. And my day-to-day work, a lot of my work is in the world of football, soccer. And I'd certainly say that a lot of the lessons that I learn and a lot of the work I do within the footballing community can be transferred towards, as you say, day-to-day life coaching, if you like, and in business, in organisations, in industry. So when I bought this book actually some time ago, and I read it, I wrote some notes, and I just found it fascinating, and I learnt loads, and that's why I was keen to get you on and to essentially go through the book chapter by chapter and just taking some of the most important points out of it and having a conversation around each one. So let's get cracking, Ben, because there's plenty to talk about and not enough time. So let's get cracking. But chapter 1, cohesion, and this chapter is really centred on an incredible football club, a Spanish football club called Athletic Bilbao, which I know some people know about the history and the sort of modern day premise behind Athletic Bilbao and what they do. But why don't we just fill the Sports Psych Show audience in terms of Athletic Bilbao?
Okay, so this is a club in the Basque heartland of Spain, and their philosophy is very unique and specific. They will only hire and pick players that are from the local region that have a Basque connection, which, when you think about how globalized football and all sport and the world is today, you would imagine is just a huge disadvantage. They are fishing in the tiniest of ponds where any other football club can sign any player from any country in the world. They are essentially saying, we don't want to do that. We will pick from our little pool of 200,000 or 300,000 people, and it totally works for them. And not only historically, where they're very proud that Athletic Club are the third highest trophy winner in Spanish football history. But in modern day football, when it has become more globalised in the last 20 or 30 years, they've also been really successful. They're one of only three teams in Spain never to have been relegated. And the other two are very obvious, Real Madrid and Barcelona. But Athletic Club have still never been relegated. And they continue to produce exceptional talent through their academy. And for them, success is not all about winning trophies. It's about continuing this story of local identity and community. And for me, that's really fascinating because it's taking a new approach to what success is. And I think one of the big things that I learned while writing Edge is that we have a very almost binary view of what success is, especially in football. It should be about winning trophies or winning things, but actually it's not. And for Athletic Club, they would rather get relegated than break this identity of. They'd rather get relegated with a local team than win La Liga with a team of Brazilians. And I found that really interesting, and the connection with their community and how that can improve performance and bring results is really interesting. And it made me think how that can be transferred to other workplaces, this idea of building a purpose that we all believe and can work towards. And they're really a unique place to be.
It's incredible, isn't it? Because as you write in the chapter, you might think that reducing the talent pool to only 3 million players, while other clubs in this globalised industry can and do recruit from all over the world, would lead Athletic struggling. And you really would think that, mate, wouldn't you? And what I love about this chapter is you succinctly strive to pinpoint where this continued success comes from. Now, I'm not too sure if this person is still at the club, but one of the main protagonists seems to be the sporting director, Jose Maria Amoroto. And at that time, obviously, you spoke to him, and I love these. He described these three central factors to success. And being a sports psychologist, my eyes lit up. This is awesome. Number one, a social purpose to represent the best qualities of the Basque region. Number two, the investment in talent as humans first, so they feel valued and in an environment where they can develop. And number three, the importance of talent retention. So these three, I suppose for me, psychosocial or psychosocial elements that drive, that underpin this sustaining level of success.
Right, and they're all totally connected. So if you are developing the human first, then you are more likely to retain the talent. If you're giving them a purpose to stay, then you're more likely to retain the talent. And if you look at some of the talent that they've had in their recent history, it's exceptional. Fernando Llorente, Ander Herrera, Emerick Laporte, Kepa, the Chelsea goalkeeper, loads of players. But for them, what they say is their only success is if they can retain that talent. So the idea that they've got this striker at the moment, Iñaki Williams, who was linked to all sorts of big clubs, really in the last 2 years, so you could say last 4 transfer windows, and they still keep him, is a sign of their success. All they want is for their best players to stay, and yet if they leave, you know, that they get a huge amount of money for them that sustains the next generation. They have an incredible training ground. They do put a lot of resource into research and development of players, in the education of players. And one thing that I really like that Athletic Club do is they have a book club with their players. And I don't mean the players speak to each other about books. They invite the fans to join them. So they have a symposium. They'll have a salon once a month where you get the players to be on a stage and in a theatre, and they would talk about the book that they've read, and they would invite fans to come and watch them and listen to them, and they'll engage on an intellectual level, nothing to do with football. It would be a book about something totally different, but this is always enhancing the connection between community and talent and the player, but also taking the player potentially out of their comfort zone into a different arena to talk about something else where their whole life they've been comfortable with a ball at their feet in front of a crowd, but now they're expected to talk about something they've read in front of a crowd, which is a different challenge for them. And yet what they're doing is providing a kind of holistic education for the player to improve them as people as well as athletes. And I think that's something that, any employee can get behind. And if you do want to retain your talent, you have to show them what your purpose is. Why should I stay here? What are you giving me that I need to make me want to stay here? And I think Athletic do that with their players brilliantly.
Well, taking another paragraph from your book, as you say, and you talk about stability here, stability enhances the sense of belonging. An environment that threatens belonging can produce uncooperative behaviour, information hoarding, and, according to a study by psychologists at UCLA, an experience equivalent to physical pain. I mean, wow. And so it's really interesting, isn't it, Ben? Because ultimately, I mean, you're talking a little bit about companies and organisations, and obviously they're always looking at their bottom line, whereas, as you mentioned earlier, this binary idea in football and all sports, certainly at the adult elite level, success, the indice of success tends to be winning and losing, that binary winning. We win, we're successful; we lose, we're failing. Whereas it feels like an indice of success at Bilbao is stability. We have to be stable. We have to retain our talent, which is taken from this local pool of players. But ultimately, and perhaps paradoxically, they win more as a consequence of not being so obsessed by winning. Does that make sense?
Absolutely right. That sounds counterintuitive, but you're absolutely correct. That is right. And I think that taps into the idea of cohesion as well. And, talent portability in general. Is it always better to sign someone, or is it better to promote someone that, that has been there a longer time, that understands the culture of the environment and can be molded and developed into the type of talent that you want? And I think we see that not just at Athletic, but we see that at other clubs as well. So Spurs is a good example of, a team that has not bought that many players in recent years, but has consistently overachieved. And yet the media builds up the drama and excitement of a team that goes on a massive spending spree and get results straight away as a huge failure. But in fact, it should be no surprise, because a team's success is built around relationships, combinations, understanding. And if you chuck 8 players in a team that they've never met each other before, then of course it's going to take time to build those relationships and that on-pitch understanding. Whereas if a team has been working essentially with the same main 9 or 10 players for 3 or 4 years, that understanding will be there. And I think that is true in any industry as well. And I think we are in a society where sometimes if you're seen to be buying someone or hiring someone, that gives the impression that you're looking to improve, and therefore that's enough. And in fact, I've spoken to club owners who have said, I have sometimes bought players knowing that they are not up to scratch, because I wanted the fans to think that I wanted to make a difference. So they do it as a very expensive marketing tool to show that they care. And to me, that sounds absurd. Just hire a coach who can improve your talent, which is another entirely different conversation, because that is the job of a coach, to improve the talent that they have, and then let them do their work.
You know what, Ben, as somebody who's very fortunate to get the opportunity to work at some of these clubs behind the scenes, it's really interesting what you're saying. It is a fascinating landscape, because I experienced the same thing, in as much as it is so exciting, especially on that transfer deadline day, and fans are baying for new blood in terms of, we want new players, that shows ambition. And that seems to be the popular consensus. But in my experience, and I can only talk about my experience, the level of complexity of onboarding a new player, and at the very, very top level, a great player, a player who has demonstrated incredible ability at the highest level. But the complexity of onboarding that player successfully, it is extremely complex. It's complicated. It's hard to do. It's not obvious that that player will transfer the ability that he or she has shown in that previous environment to the environment where they've just transferred to.
Right, and why is that player wanted by that particular club? Is because they have impressed with the relationships and combinations and understanding they have built up with their previous teammates. So what you're doing is taking them away from those teammates and say, I'm going to give you a whole new environment, a whole new set of teammates, and I want you to be even better than you were last time round. And I'm expecting that because I've put a price on how much I think that is worth. I mean, that is an incredible pressure for anyone. And I think it's something that we don't really think about because we look at talent and performance and see it as a very individual thing, when in fact it's a result of everyone else around you as well.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm mindful of wanting to get on to the next chapter, but what interests me there, what you were saying there, is how can we simply expect a player from a previous environment to transfer it to the new environment, because the previous environment, a lot of what they were doing in that environment, a lot of the reason why they were successful is because of teammates. And I just think of the great work my friends at AIK in Sweden, in Stockholm, are doing, and they will talk about football being about interactions rather than just actions. And it's interesting, I was just thinking there as you were speaking, we do obsess actions. We think of players and we say, I don't know, I'm going to come to say somebody off the top of my head, Neymar for instance, and we say, this guy's so skillful, it's so amazing, these actions are incredible, but actually forgetting that a player is one player in a team, and it's the interactions that helps a player become successful. And I think on that basis, I mean, that's a neat segue into chapter 2, which is about adaptability. The heading of that chapter is adaptability. And you centre on Thomas Tuchel, the manager who at the time was at Dortmund, but is now at PSG. So why did you go and visit Tuchel?
Oh, well, I was always interested in him because I'd followed his career. I knew he was a very interesting coach. I find that the new almost prototype of coaches, coaches that were not successful players, and so therefore don't go into a dressing room and say, well, this is how it was in my day. That is an outdated model. Mm-hmm. So I see him as really a pioneer in some ways, really interesting approach to coaching and improving talent and psychology. Very interesting concept of what is success, because when he was at Dortmund, he finished second and behind Bayern Munich, and it was deemed a failure, but Bayern Munich's budget was greatly larger than Dortmund, so he was kind of frustrated and wanted to redefine his own measure of success. But he was also really interesting about motivation and how you try and motivate a dressing room or a team of individuals, and how you have to find the individual trigger for each of them. But the key word is individual, because they're all different and they all have different stories, different journeys, different backgrounds, different trajectories. You would know this, Dan, having spent time with lots of different clubs and lots of different players. What works for one will not work for another. So he came up with a simplified version of a scale of motivation, which I really like and found quite interesting. And he calls it an ABC scale. And A stands for aggressive, which means you're aggressively motivated. Doesn't mean you're an aggressive person. It means you're aggressively motivated. And by that, he means you want to be the star. You want to be the top scorer. You want to be on the front of the magazines, etc. And when he was at Dortmund, that player was Aubameyang, the main striker. And there is no implied criticism of anyone who has this type of dominant motivation. It's just one type of, he said 3, there are probably more. His B type. A is for aggressive, B is for binding. And that is for someone who wants to be part of a team, just feels like he's part of the team, good in the group, is often on the captaincy board or the senior leadership group.
Yeah.
And at Dortmund, that was Marcel Schmelzer. So he could play in any position. Do whatever he'd do it for the team, and it was great. And C is for curious. And these are guys who are interested in their own talent development and, as he put it, will try a back heel in their own area away at Bayern Munich, and will try risky things because they just want to see where their talent takes them. And at Dortmund, that was Ousmane Dembele and Rafa Guerreiro as well, the midfielder who moved to full-back and now can play sort of in any position. But what's interesting to me is now Tuchel has moved to Paris Saint-Germain, where there is a very clear and also binary definition of success, which is win the Champions League. So anything that he does that is not winning the Champions League is seen as not successful. And anything else is where if he wins it is successful, which I think doesn't really fit for his model. So he's had to adjust and learn and adapt to managing up as well as managing down. But also in the dressing room at Paris Saint-Germain, he's surrounded by superstar players, and he's got people who are aggressively motivated. Neymar is a very obvious one. In fact, if you look at his forward line, he's got aggressively motivated is Neymar. Bindingly motivated, I would say, is Edinson Cavani, who's been there a long time, top scorer, but doesn't make a fuss and always does his best for the team. And curiously motivated is Kylian Mbappe. So he's got a strike force, really, of these three different types of players. And it's not just we're all aggressive, we're all binding, we're all curious. We all have probably a bit of each of them, but one is more dominant than the other. So I asked Tuchel what his dominant motivation was. And he said probably he's curious. But once you take the PSG job, you're probably sliding into the aggressive category as well. But who knows? But I did find it a really interesting way of looking at how you separate a group into individuals, really. But it is simplified because there are more than three different types of motivation. But I do think we need to think about what our own motivation is and what inspires us and triggers us to improve and develop our own talent. And if we're in the business of improving others, we need to think more about what their motivations are as well.
Look, I think it's really interesting. I think there's plenty to say about what you've just said, actually, because I think, let's take that last thing first. It might feel a bit contradictory to say, to talk about Tuchel and how he said, well, everybody's an individual. But here's my three-pronged system or framework, if you like. But I don't think it is contradictory, because what I like about it is in his narrative, and his narrative to the world is, look, everybody's an individual. So as a coach, you've got to bear that in mind. You've got 25 or 20 or 15 individuals in front of you. And I'm going to create a framework that can help me uncover where these individuals might lie. And it's as you said at the end there, look, one could argue that scientifically there are more types of motivation. Motivation is multi-dimensional, but he's created a framework. And I think that's what coaches don't do enough of, is they don't create frameworks. I go around the world talking about creating a mental skills framework, or a framework for the mental side of the game for players. And I love what he's done there, because he's not standardizing it. He's creating a framework that is individual specific, but can help you categorize players in your own mind as a coach. So I think that's the first thing to say there. And I think the second thing to say is, I think what you said about his move to PSG is really pertinent. And hey, we're here in end of or mid to end of 2019, and they might go and win the Champions League in 2020. But as you said, it doesn't seem to, at the moment, feel like a great fit for Tuchel. I mean, I could lift a quote from your chapter there where he said, "Points are not the only way to judge my work." and you could exchange points for trophies, couldn't you? Trophies are not the only way to judge my work. This guy is curious, as you say. He's an innovator, and as you write about in this chapter, he's the only sporting leader to address a group called the Rule Breakers Society, who are disruptive innovators. So it just seems to be a strange fit there, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but I think his curiosity is what took him there, because the chance to coach, this type of team with this challenge, is probably quite difficult to turn down. And yet, I totally agree that if he doesn't win the Champions League, that doesn't mean he's been a failure. In fact, if he survives 2 seasons, he's probably been a success, because, lesser managers have not survived that long there. So I think there is a disconnect between what his owners are asking for and what his general philosophy is. But he probably did it to challenge himself as well. I mean, it's really an interesting one, but I think where he goes after that will probably be more of a career move than this. I see this as like him tapping into his curiosity, seeing if he can cope, and it's also a learning process for him. And I think he sees his role as a coach, and this is what I found interesting about most of the coaches I spoke to, is that they are also always learning as well. And Tuchel, in fact, was the first one to say to me, the thing about my job is every assessment of it is always done in hindsight, right? If I could have a performance review before every match instead of after every match, I'd probably do really well, because I can explain why I picked this team. I think this player is very good at finding space here. I'm trying to create opportunities for my players to find space and teach them how to do it, and then they have to finish it off, because Tuchel is not putting the ball in the back of the net for them. The players have to obviously do that themselves, and I'm just trying to pick the best team and the best tactics to make that happen and create the best environment for that. Now, if it doesn't happen, then he is seen in some way to have failed or underperformed in his job. But it's not that simple, and it's not that binary. And so, as you said when you were quoting him, trophies and points are not the only way to measure his performance and his success. And in fact, if Mbappe continues to produce the types of performance that we know he's capable of in the next year, then you could argue that Tuchel has taken the talent and improved it, like he did with Ousmane Dembele, turning a £10 million talent into a £120 million talent. If he improves Mbappe as much as he has been doing, or continues to revitalise the career of Angel Di Maria or whoever it is, that's actually his job. His job is to improve the talent of the people around him, and trophies are potentially a byproduct of that, but not necessarily the be-all and end-all of that. So it's an interesting period of his career, one that I'm obviously following very closely.
It's a tension point, isn't it? It's a tension point in as much as, is my job here to win trophies, to get promotion, to pick up silverware? Is my job here to develop players so that they go for a big fee, or just develop players because they can become the best players in the world? Is it possible to have both? Maybe he feels it is possible to have. Maybe that's the challenge, that's the curiosity in him. Can I have both? Can I develop players and win these trophies?
Right, and at Dortmund he had a very clear idea of what his purpose was. It was to do those things, but it was also to provide an emotional connection between the fans and the team, and that comes from how you approach how you play the game. And if you play in a defensive way, that's not going to work in front of the yellow wall at Dortmund. So he created a tactical system and a way of playing that was kind of Klopp times 4. And at one point he had I think he played a system with two defenders. I think it was like a 2-3-4 system or some bizarre system where there was only two defenders in the back and 4 or 5 strikers. And, and the fans loved it. And so he talked about this emotional connection because, the stakeholders that people talk about in terms of who a coach answers to are not just the players, the board, the owner, but it's also the fans as well. So if the fans have an emotional connection or feel some kind of energy or spirit just by walking into the stadium or talking about their team, that itself is an enormously powerful tool for a coach to be able to develop within a community, to bring to a place. And if we see clubs as hubs of local identity and community, and the responsibility of the coach, as well as to develop talent and win matches and be answerable to the owners and the board and turn a profit, is to fulfill the brief of what that identity means and develop that sense of community within that. I mean, that's a lot of boxes that person's got to tick. But I think Tuchel sees that emotional connection as very, very important as well.
Yeah, and you see, as you're speaking there, I mean, this is the not constant debate, but constant discussion I have with coaches of all sports, is what does one put, whether it's describing it as what does one put first, or whether it's how does coaching function. When I listen to you speak about these top coaches, I hear psychosocial. And look, I'm a sports psychologist, so maybe I'm biased, but I hear the psychosocial side of things. And I think sometimes these coaches, and we're going to go on to a very famous person and coach in a second for chapter 3, but when we think of Tuchel and we think of the other coaches, and we might think of Klopp and Guardiola and Pochettino right now, certainly in British football, we are inclined to, we're kind of socialised into tactics, genius tactics, and we see these things coming up on Twitter about the tactical genius of these guys. But if anything, I think what your book is saying across the board is actually these great coaches are psychosocial coaches first and foremost. It doesn't mean they're ignoring the tactical side, but they're inextricably linked. To be the best tactical coach that I can be, and to be the best technical coach that I can be, if that's how we want to describe it, developing players, I have to be a great psychosocial coach, or psych-social coach, as I would say.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, if you look at last season, the two most successful coaches, who reached the Champions League final, Klopp and Pochettino, I mean, after the semi-finals, they were both in tears, right? So they're emotionally open and vulnerable. They have both of them a connection with their fans that has taken years to develop, but is now feels very, very strong. But not only that, but the players that helped them reach the Champions League final, in Spurs' case was Lucas Moura, and in Liverpool's case was Divock Origi, who scored the 4th goal against Barcelona, are both kind of fringe players. They were certainly not starters throughout the season, and yet when their team needed them, when their coach needed them, they were able to step up because I think of this psychosocial element that the coach had and allowed them to feel enough part of the unit that when it mattered, they were able to step up and perform. And I feel that is all connected with this sense of belonging, community, cohesion, but also emotional intelligence and openness as well. And I found it really interesting that Pochettino was in tears after the game and everyone thought it was great. And Lucas Moura was giving an interview in Portuguese to Brazilian TV, and he was in floods of tears after his hat-trick against Ajax. And Jurgen Klopp was crying, and James Milner was in tears because this is probably the last time he thought he'd ever get a chance to play in a Champions League final. And all these guys are showing vulnerability, almost redefining what it is to be a modern male hero. And the social impact of that is, I think, really powerful and enormous. And so the role of coach is far-reaching, but the impact of their behaviours is also far-reaching. And I think we're seeing with this, well, I say modern type of coach, but the coaches that I spoke to, like Tuchel, like the others, Graham Potter and Didier Deschamps, slightly less so, but the others, they are emotionally open. They're definitely vulnerable, but they're also social coaches to their core.
And using this word vulnerability, and don't get me started because we'll be here all day. I mean, you can't have excellence without vulnerability. In my opinion, you just cannot have excellence. And this is where sport has been so wrong for the last 50 years, ignoring vulnerability. This notion of man up and sport ignoring vulnerability, and not allowing people to have, groups to have psychological safety when it comes to vulnerability, mistakes and hardship and adversity. I think it's so important. I really do.
Yeah, I agree, but I think the good thing is that eventually and belatedly, the football world is coming round to that, and I think seeing this vulnerability among some of the Premier League's leading managers can only be a good thing, because the more we see it, the more we can realise that it is actually a strength.
Well, let's quickly move on to chapter 3, which is about decision making, and none other than Johan Cruyff lies at the heart of this chapter. So, talk to us a little bit about decision making. What's this chapter about?
Well, I spent time at Ajax investigating the methodology behind Cruyff Football, and this is now a methodology that is internationalized. There is a brand called Cruyff Football, and it teaches football in China, and it teaches football all around the world, in America as well. And I really wanted to get to the bottom of what it stood for, what it was about. And interestingly, there was a moment in Cruyff's career when he was clearly the best player in all the teams he played for. But when he was 16, he was taken out of his youth team and told to spend 3 weeks with an athletics coach, with a running coach, to improve his running style and his speed. And he's like, well, if we do that, that's fine, but we're not going to do as well in our matches during that period because I won't be there. And the coach was like, yes, I know that, but sometimes results are not the only thing that matters. We need to focus on the individual and the development of that individual rather than the result of the team, which is at the time in the mid 60s was kind of unheard of. So he went and practiced his running and learned some new tricks to improve his running style. The team didn't do as well, obviously, in his absence, but he came back and he actually took that lesson on board when he became a coach and realised that to improve as a talent, every talent is individual, something we've already discussed, but also at youth level, results are totally irrelevant and it doesn't matter. And performance is more important than result, and individual development is more important than result. And so often at the youth level, we see coaches picking the oldest players or the biggest players. This is about the relative age effect, because they want to get results, because they want to keep their jobs. And there's for too long been a culture of, if your results aren't good, then your job is under threat. And people don't want to lose their job, so they try and pick players to get the best results, but that doesn't lead to the best long-term outcomes for the individuals or for the development of the whole system. So the Cruyff idea was really to focus on the individual and to put performance ahead of result, and I think that is really true and something that we can think about in any walk of life as well. So if my children are doing a spelling test and they're stuck on something and ask me a question, it's hard for me, but sometimes I'll say, get it wrong and then you'll learn from it, rather than let me tell you the answer so you'll get a good mark but you'll never learn the spelling of that word. So sometimes it is about the performance and the development that has to come before the result. And that was really the key lesson from Cruyff.
Well, within the chapter, you detail Cruyff's player paradigm model. And there's 5 truths or steps to this. Number 1, individual development is not linear. And that's very much based on the sort of the biological patterns that you talk about, or you've just spoken about. Number 2, the player is key. Again, you've just talked about the individual player and people being individuals. Number 3, the coach as mentor. So the coach observing and adjusting the learning environment to stimulate player development. Number 4, having a prepared learning environment. So essentially supervising and facilitating self-regulation and adapting facilities to appropriate age groups. And then number 5, potentiality versus actuality, which is interesting, which is where he says that coaches who focus on results in the future, not right now, well, they tend to be the best coaches because they're not looking at what they're seeing right now. They're looking at the potential that player has, a vision of the end in mind, essentially. I think those are just 5 absolutely. And again, look, I come back to everybody. I think a lot of people would perceive Cruyff as a tactician, a technician, but again, 5 psychosocial keys driving, the tech, tack, and physical sides of the game.
No, he was a developer. He was an innovator, but at his heart, he was a talent developer. And so this idea of creating the environment for learning and improvement and focusing on not the present but the future, so finding players that have high potential more interesting, it is really at the heart of what he was about. And yet it's very difficult to put that kind of philosophy in certain environments because so much of football is about short-termism. If you lose 3 or 4 games in a row, you are in serious trouble and under pressure. And it's very, very difficult to have that strategy as a successful one if you're working with people who don't share that philosophy. So that can only work in certain environments. And, it works at Ajax, but it also works in other places where there is a clear strategy. And I think the clubs we've also spoken about, Spurs and Liverpool, have a similar strategy. And if it's not exactly the same, it is a long-term view to talent, potential, and development. And I think those things are really important. And I guess in recent years we've seen that Manchester United haven't. They've bought players of a certain age, and there hasn't been that much of a talent pathway. And I guess you could say the same at Chelsea as well. Although things are changing at both those clubs, but it takes time to develop this long-term strategy. And I hope that both Manchester United and Chelsea stick with it, even if results don't go their way, because you may well get to a situation where for a few years they've allowed this talent pathway to develop between the academy and the first team. Results have not gone their way, so they throw it out the bottle and say, right, that's not working. Let's go back to the old way and sign Alexis Sanchez and a couple of 29-year-olds who want a last payday. So you do need to stay strong and stick firm to that strategy once you have it, which I found interesting. The other thing I found interesting about my trip to the Netherlands was I went to AZ Alkmaar, which is a small team just outside of Amsterdam. And they have a philosophy around talent development, which is about thinking about why and what your purpose is and the impact that you're going to make. And it's really inspired by Simon Sinek and his Golden Circle, which is he wrote a book called Start With Why, which I'm sure you probably know about.
Indeed, yeah.
It's asking about the purpose, and the why is the purpose. Why am I here, and what am I trying to do here? And when RZ want to persuade a player to come play for them, a young player, they start with a why. So they look inside and they work their way out. So their pitch to parents might be, well, our why is we challenge and we develop our young talents into respectful and curious athletes. And it just so happens that we're a football club. Now, others might say, oh, we're the biggest football club, we've won the most trophies, and we can help your kid become a top player. But RZ is starting from the inside and working out, and I find that a really interesting concept as well, to think about this idea of purpose and impact, and that's something that that we've touched on already in this conversation. But I think it's something that we really need to be mindful of as well, and everyone does need to think about what their why is. Tuchel needs to think about what his why is, and we all need to think about what ours is. What is the purpose of our work and what we're doing, and why are we doing it? And if we understand that, I think we can actually become better at doing it ourselves.
Completely agree. Now, chapter 4, being a sports psychologist, completely biased. Love this chapter because it's about resilience. And you had the fantastic opportunity to sit down with Tim Harkness, who's he's now the head of sports science and psychology at Chelsea. He's one of the longest serving members, isn't he? Longest serving employees at Chelsea. So talk to us a little bit about resilience, Ben. What's your take on resilience? What conversations did you have with Tim?
So this was one of my favourite interviews, actually, because Tim was so interesting talking about resilience. There are a few things that I took from it, and one thing I took that has really helped me in my everyday life. First of all, there's the definition of resilience, which a lot of people think is bounce back ability or coping with adversity. But Tim Harkness defined it to me as the ability to accurately assess threats and opportunities and to allocate the emotional resources accordingly. Now, there are two key words in there. One is accurate, to accurately assess, and the other is opportunity. So resilience, not just about negativity and coping with negativity, because a lot of my conversations was how do we actually cope with success? And that is sometimes very difficult as well, especially when you're dealing with young players who've worked towards a goal since their childhood, finally reach that point and kind of wonder where they go now or how they cope with that. So it's not just about coping with adversity, but it's also about coping with success, which I found really interesting. And one of the ways he told me to deal with these threats and opportunities is to ask yourself 3 questions. And the 3 questions are about intent, frequency, and impact. And this is really evaluating whether an emotional response is accurate or not, because how can we possibly know if it's accurate? So the first one is about intent. So was this event intended? So let's make up an event that's happened. All right, so Dan, we are traveling somewhere on the underground together, and you trodden on my foot. Okay, so was the event intended? Did you mean to stand on my foot? Okay, so that's the first question I ask. Okay, was it intended? So I have to think, if I'm making an accurate response to this, was it intended? So that's the first question. Maybe you didn't stand on my foot on purpose. The second question is around frequency. So how often did this happen? Did you stand on my foot like 4 times in a row? Every time I see you, do you always stand on my foot? Okay, if that is the case, then I think I have grounds for a certain emotional response to this. And that can help me come up with that response. Maybe, you're always standing on my toe, and that would really bug me. And the third question is about impact. Right? How important is it to my whole life that you have stood on my foot? Is it absolute agony and I can't walk again for another year? Or am I actually fine, really? So this idea of impact is important. And if our whole relationship is based around you standing on my foot, then I probably would be a bit more upset. So the idea of emotionally accurately allocating these emotional resources are based around those three questions. And I have asked myself those questions all the time when I'm confronted with a challenging situation. So if I have a difficult phone call with an editor or someone I work with, or with a football club, or a coach that asks me some challenging questions, I have to ask myself, what is the intent, what is the frequency, and what is the impact? And only then can I allocate the accurate emotional resource to this. And I found that really, really helpful in helping me deal with difficult situations. And I can see why Tim Harkness has survived, I think, nearly 10 years at Chelsea, working under 7 or 8 different coaches. So he's a really inspiring individual, and I think there are lessons in that chapter that have really helped me.
As you were speaking there, the 2 words that sprung to mind for me was clarity and rationality. That 3-pronged question, that 3-pronged process, if you like, the 3 questions, helps you clear your mind, and then helps you think rationally about the situation, which I think that, as you've alluded to there, is just so important. It's such an important skill, and I think that term skill is important to use as well. And I think you mentioned this in the chapter, that resilience is a set of skills and not character, which I think is great, and I think for me personally is true, and I think it's true to a degree. I mean, as a sports psychologist who's really interested in personality science, I think there are personality characteristics that impinge on resilience. There are a raft of neurotic responses that impact, and some people are better at dealing with that neuroticism than others, and there is always a debate within psychology as to how much shift you can get. There are probably some people, irrespective of their skill level, who will really struggle to turn down the volume of hostility or an anxiety response. But with skills, you can get some shift, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dan. And one of the things that I really learned throughout the research for the book was that a lot of these are skills, and a lot of them are learnable or improvable. So I always assumed that you're either resilient or you're not, and good luck with that. But actually, as you say, and as Tim Hartness says, these are skills that can be worked on and improved. So I think in a very emotional industry like football, it helps to be able to have a space where you can be rational, and that can be very, very helpful.
I think the final thing to say about this chapter, and I'm coming back to the definition of resilience that you and Tim spoke about, and I love that notion of the allocation of emotional resources, or allocating your emotional resources accordingly. And that it's not about having more or less emotion, it's about having more accurate emotion, and it's where I position that emotion. I just think that's such an important part of the definition. And I take that from my own work. I mean, a working example could be that I have a competitor at the moment. I won't obviously name the person, and I won't name the sport, but who's just actually recently, off the back of a fantastic performance, an incredible performance, and we had a conversation around where he should be directing his attention and his emotion, because attention and emotion work hand in hand, where he should be directing his attention and emotion in his next game. And I think the obvious thing that competitors do in all sports is they go, "Oh, I've just had this incredible game, so I need to go into the next game, and I need to repeat that, and I need to take this emotion, and I need to be right. I've got to perform. I've done it last week. I know I can this week." And it's like, whoa, stop, hold on. Actually, is there actually a more pragmatic, more optimal focus of attention that you can have, by which you can accurately direct your emotion. And he came up with this more than anybody, to just focus on the things that he could control, which were certain actions and certain responsibilities and certain reactions in the performance environment. And I just think that's great. And so I just draw that back to this notion of resilience is the capacity to allocate that emotional resource accordingly.
That's right. And I think because we always associate it with negativity, your example is about this guy trying to cope with success. And I think it is just as hard, probably harder, to be able to cope in that environment because it's slightly rarer, it's harder, and I think it's underrated and underspoken about because you assume that once you get there, everything is easier. But actually, it's hard to cope with success. And so the fact that you've come up with a solution, devise a solution on the back of it, I think is really great.
We're on to our final chapter, creativity. And I love the approach you took with this chapter. You really emphasised women in football and gender equality. Why don't you briefly take us through what you wrote about in chapter 5, and that's entitled Creativity?
Well, creativity is a really nebulous term, isn't it? It's very difficult to define, and we all kind of want it, but if we all have too much of it, then sometimes we can't get the results we want. So I wanted to speak to people that had found creative solutions to problems. And so one of the first people I spoke to was the owner of a French football club who was looking for a coach. He was in his team were in the second division. He had a very small budget. He was looking for a coach for his team, and he appointed a woman called Corinne Diac, who is a brilliant coach and happens to be female. So she was the first female coach to work in a top 5 European league, although albeit the second division, for longer than a season. And she was there for 3 seasons, and the team had the 17th highest budget in the league, and I think she finished 10th, 12th and 8th in that division. And she was excellent. And so I wanted to speak to him about how he chose her and why he chose her. And I wanted to speak to her as well, but sadly was unable to because she was bored of talking about it, which I also understand. But I also spoke to Emma Hayes, who is the Chelsea women's coach, and a brilliant speaker and a brilliant advocate for coaches in general, but also a role model for women across the world. I would not be surprised if she coaches a men's team in England at some point in the future. I think they would be lucky to have her, to be honest. But I really wanted to look at the idea of unconscious bias, gender inequality, and how it informs, impacts productivity or lack thereof, and basically affects performance in a negative way. I mean, if you look at how few club environments have women in their inner circle, it is really surprising and astonishing. And it's very clear that if you have gender equality in a boardroom, your results will be better than if you don't. And so I'm staggered even now that football clubs have not taken this on board. And I think the sooner that football clubs have more women in senior leadership positions, both on the sporting side and the executive side, the better they will perform. It will improve results. It seems very bizarre to me that that's not the case. So speaking to some key female leaders in football led me to that conclusion. And, you know, it's really not a creative solution to hire a talented woman for a men's football team. It's really not that creative. It actually is sensible and ridiculous not to.
Well, you had a very interesting interview with a woman called Cindy Gallop, who's the former chair at an advertising company called Bartle, Bogle and Hegarty. And before you answer this, please, this is a non-swearing podcast, so, and I say that laughing because, yes, she was quite vociferous in getting her view across that women need to be in these key decision-making roles and roles with influence, because we're missing a whole chunk of creativity and effectiveness within our organisations. I mean, just to finish off, because I think she sounds absolutely brilliant. Can you tell us a little bit about what she said?
Yeah, well, without turning the air blue, I can only tell you half of what she said.
Yes, please.
Lots of beeps. But I found it interesting that she swore so much in itself, because most of the coaches I spoke to did not swear, and those that did swore infrequently. But she swore so much, it felt to me that it was a really clear, conscious effort to almost reclaim a swearing space and to make me question my response to it, because if it was a man doing it, I probably wouldn't have even mentioned it or thought twice about it or included the quotes in the book. But I really felt I had to, because she's in her 50s, she was very smart, she's got a very cut glass London accent, and so she was forcing me almost to confront my own bias, because I wasn't expecting her to be so sweary. But why shouldn't she be? This is a subject she's really passionate about, that she believes in, and her main point is that men are hired and promoted on potential, and women have to have proof. So if you look at a CV of one or the other, and there are loads of examples of this, and there's a man's name on the CV, they'll get hired, and there's a woman's name that they won't. And with blind music auditions, loads more women got hired, whereas when they were cited, they weren't. So there's loads of proof that this bias happens. And she believes that women are held to a different set of standards. And I think she's right, and it's really remiss of football clubs to be missing a huge opportunity to hire half the population to improve their own performance, that of their players. And I've also spoken to players as well who said that if there was more female presence in the dressing room or in and around their environments, that they think it would be beneficial to them as well, to detoxify a macho masculine environment. We've spoken about vulnerability in the past, but to me, I just can't see any downside to this at all. It's just win-win, and it's a very slow battle. And I'm speaking to clubs all the time about their approach to it and what they're doing about it. And progress is slow.
Absolutely, agreed. Well, Ben, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, a brilliant insight into your book, which I absolutely loved, and there's just so many little take-homes for coaches. And obviously the point of the book was to correlate football and the corporate sector and utilising psychology within industry and the relationship between football and success in industry and organisations. So, and you do so brilliantly, and it's something. It's a book I'd recommend to any coach. And with that in mind, where can people get hold of a book? I mean, I know it's a couple of years old now, so and I know it's been very popular. But where can people get hold of the book? Where can people find you as well, mate?
Yeah, so the best place to get the book is Amazon. It's called Edge: Leadership Secrets from Football's Top Thinkers. I am on Twitter. My handle is @BenLytt, which is LYT, BenLytt. And feel free to hit me up. I follow most people who follow me, and I'm really interested in conversations about coaching, about talent development, about elite performance, about using football as a force for good. And yes, I hope you enjoy the book, and thank you very much, Dan.
No problem at all. That was Ben Lyttleton, everybody. I really enjoyed that, so thank you so much, Ben. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.